What if I told you that one man's secrets helped the Soviet Union detonate their first atomic bomb 4 years earlier than expected? What if that man wasn't a hardened spy, but a quiet, unassuming physicist who believed he was saving the world? This is a story of Klaus Fuchs, the scientist who committed what many call the most damaging act of espionage in the 20th century. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. He wasn't motivated by money, fame, or even revenge. His reasons were far more complex, and understanding them will change how you think about loyalty, ideology, and the thin line between heroism and betrayal. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one man's conscience became the catalyst for the most terrifying arms race in human history, and why his story still matters today in our age of technological secrets and global tensions. So buckle up, because we're diving deep into espionage, nuclear weapons, and one of history's most consequential betrayals. To understand how Klaus Fuchs became one of the most damaging spies in history, we need to go back to where it all began, Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs was born in 1911 in a small German town to a Lutheran pastor and his wife. On the surface, his childhood seemed ordinary, even privileged. But beneath that surface, tragedy and turmoil were brewing. His mother suffered from severe mental illness and eventually took her own life. This trauma would shape Klaus profoundly, making him introspective, serious, and deeply committed to finding meaning in a chaotic world. But here's where the story takes its first critical turn. Young Klaus didn't turn to religion like his father. Instead, he turned to politics, specifically to communism. Now, before you write him off as just another radical, you need to understand the context. This was Weimar Germany, a nation in absolute crisis. Hyperinflation had destroyed the economy. The humiliation of World War I still stung. Extremism was rising on all sides. And into this chaos, the Nazi Party was beginning its terrifying ascent. For idealistic young people like Fuchs, communism represented hope, equality, and resistance against fascism. It wasn't about gulags or Stalin's purges, which many in the West didn't fully understand yet. It was about workers' rights, social justice, and standing against the darkness of Nazism. Fuchs joined the Communist Party of Germany while studying physics at university. And this decision would mark him for life. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Fuchs wasn't just a concerned citizen. He was an active communist, and that made him a target. The Gestapo began hunting down communists with brutal efficiency. Fuchs had to flee for his life. He escaped to Britain, arriving as a refugee with nothing but his brilliant mind and his unshakable political convictions. The British took him in. They gave him opportunities. They let him continue his studies. And remarkably, they would eventually trust him with their most vital secrets. This is where the psychological complexity deepens. Fuchs was genuinely grateful to Britain. He wasn't some cold-hearted traitor. He appreciated his adopted homeland, made friends there, and built a life. But his loyalty to communist ideology ran deeper than gratitude, deeper than citizenship, deeper than anything else in his life. By the late 1930s, Fuchs had earned his doctorate in physics and was making a name for himself in theoretical physics. He was quiet, diligent, and absolutely brilliant. His colleagues described him as reserved but friendly, someone who kept his private thoughts private. And then came World War II. When Britain entered the war against Nazi Germany, Klaus Fuchs faced a paradox. As a German refugee and former communist, he was technically an enemy alien and was even briefly interned. But Britain desperately needed scientists, especially physicists who could help with the war effort. The British authorities made a calculation. Fuchs hated the Nazis, he was brilliant, and they needed him. So they brought him into one of the most secret projects imaginable, the effort to understand atomic fission and potentially build an atomic weapon. Think about this for a moment. A German refugee communist was being trusted with Britain's most sensitive military research. The security screening of that era seems almost laughable by today's standards, but they were desperate. They were fighting for survival against Hitler. Fuchs threw himself into the work. He was assigned to the theoretical physics team, working on what the British called tube alloys, their code name for atomic weapons research. And he was exceptional at it. His mathematical abilities and theoretical insights made him invaluable. But here's what the British didn't know. Fuchs had already made a decision that would change history. He had decided that the Soviet Union, Britain's ally against Hitler, but also a communist state, should have access to this atomic research. His reasoning went something like this. The Soviets were bearing the brunt of the war against Hitler. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were dying on the Eastern Front. If there was going to be a powerful new weapon, the Soviet Union had a right to know about it. More importantly, Fuchs believed that if only the Western powers had atomic weapons after the war, they would use that monopoly to destroy the Soviet Union and crush communism. In his mind, he wasn't betraying Britain. He was creating balance. He was preventing a post-war catastrophe. He was, in his own twisted logic, serving a higher moral purpose. In 1941, Fuchs made contact with Soviet intelligence through the Soviet military attaché in Britain. He began passing information about British atomic research, not occasionally, systematically, comprehensively. The Soviets couldn't believe their luck. Here was a scientist at the heart of the Allied atomic program, willingly providing detailed technical information. And he didn't want money. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted the information shared. Then, in 1943, everything escalated dramatically. The British atomic program merged with a massive American effort known as the Manhattan Project. The center of atomic weapons research moved to the United States, to secret facilities in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and other locations scattered across America. And Klaus Fuchs went with them. He was assigned to the Los Alamos Laboratory, the crown jewel of the Manhattan Project, where the greatest scientific minds of the generation were working under Robert Oppenheimer to build the world's first atomic bomb. Los Alamos was supposed to be impenetrable. It was isolated in the New Mexico desert. Security was intense. Everyone was vetted. Everyone was watched. It was a secret city where thousands of people worked on the most important military project in history. And inside this fortress, Klaus Fuchs was passing comprehensive technical details to the Soviet Union. He met with his Soviet handler, a chemist named Harry Gold, in locations around the American Southwest. The two would rendezvous in quiet spots, and Fuchs would hand over documents, sketches, and detailed explanations of the bomb's design. The information he provided was breathtaking in its scope and importance. He gave the Soviets details about the implosion design for the plutonium bomb, calculations on the critical mass needed for fission, information about uranium enrichment processes, details about the initiator that would trigger the chain reaction, theoretical calculations that had taken the Manhattan Project years to develop. Imagine the scene. While American scientists were working 18-hour days in secrecy, believing they were in a race against Nazi Germany to build a bomb first, one of their trusted colleagues was ensuring that the Soviet Union had access to everything they discovered. Fuchs was present for some of the most pivotal moments in scientific history. He was there for the Trinity test in July 1945, when the first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert, releasing power that had never before been unleashed by human beings. He saw the mushroom cloud rise. He felt the heat and the shock wave. He understood, perhaps better than most, what humanity had just created, and he made sure Moscow knew every detail. By the war's end, Fuchs had become one of the most knowledgeable people on Earth about atomic weapons design. When he returned to Britain in 1946 to work at the British Atomic Research Facility at Harwell, he continued his espionage, now passing information about Britain's independent nuclear program. The Soviets were building their bomb, using Fuchs's information as a roadmap. They didn't have to go down the dead ends. They didn't have to waste years on failed designs. They had a cheat sheet written by one of the West's best physicists. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. The test shocked the West. American intelligence had predicted the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb until the mid-1950s at the earliest. They were off by 4 years. And Klaus Fuchs was a primary reason why. By 1949, the world had changed. The wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the West had completely collapsed. The Cold War was beginning. The communist takeover of China had just succeeded. The Berlin blockade had shown how tense East-West relations had become. And in intelligence circles in Washington and London, people were asking a terrifying question. How did the Soviets get the bomb so fast? The answer, they suspected, was espionage. Someone had betrayed the Manhattan Project. American and British intelligence agencies began one of the most intensive mole hunts in history. They had fragments of evidence, pieces of a puzzle, intercepted Soviet communications, decoded through a program called Venona, suggested there had been multiple spies in the atomic program. The investigators followed thread after thread. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at who had access to what information. They examined timelines and travel records. And slowly, painfully, the evidence began pointing toward Klaus Fuchs. But here's what makes this part of the story so chilling. Fuchs had been almost perfectly careful. He hadn't lived lavishly. He hadn't bragged. He hadn't made obvious mistakes. He had compartmentalized his life completely, keeping his espionage activities separate from his scientific work and personal relationships. The break in the case came from signals intelligence and painstaking investigative work. British intelligence officer William Scarden was assigned to interview Fuchs. Scarden was a master interrogator, patient and methodical. The interviews began casually in late 1949. Scarden would visit Fuchs at Harwell, and they would talk about physics, about life, about politics. Scarden never directly accused Fuchs. He just talked, and slowly, the pressure built. Now, here's where the psychology becomes fascinating. Fuchs was under no legal obligation to confess. The evidence against him, while suggestive, wasn't overwhelming. A good lawyer could have advised him to say nothing, to deny everything. But Fuchs was carrying an enormous burden. For years, he had lived a double life. He had lied to colleagues he respected. He had betrayed people who trusted him. And perhaps most importantly, his ideological certainty was beginning to crack. The Soviet Union, he believed in, wasn't the workers' paradise he'd imagined. Stalin's purges were becoming known. The totalitarian nature of Soviet communism was increasingly clear. The world Fuchs thought he was helping to create looked very different from reality. In January 1950, after months of interviews, Klaus Fuchs confessed. He didn't confess because he was broken by harsh interrogation. He confessed because, in his own words, he could no longer live with the division between his two selves. The psychological strain had become unbearable. His confession was detailed and methodical, just like his scientific work. He explained what he had passed, when, to whom, and why. He provided information that would lead to the arrest of his courier, Harry Gold, which in turn would lead to the exposure of other Soviet spies, including the Rosenbergs. The confession detonated like a bomb in the Western intelligence community. One of Britain's most trusted atomic scientists had been a Soviet spy throughout the entire Manhattan Project and beyond. The implications were staggering. Everything the Soviets knew about Western atomic weapons had to be assumed compromised. Security procedures had to be completely overhauled. Fuchs was arrested in February 1950. His trial was brief. Under British law at the time, the maximum sentence for passing secrets to an ally during wartime was 14 years. Even though the Soviet Union was no longer an ally, that's the law under which he was prosecuted. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The courtroom reaction was muted, but shocked. Here was a man who had potentially altered the balance of global power, who had contributed to a nuclear arms race that would threaten humanity for generations, and he would serve just 14 years. The press coverage was enormous. Headlines screamed about betrayal and treason. Politicians demanded answers about how this could have happened. The case intensified the Red Scare in America and led to massive security overhauls. But here's what's remarkable. Even after his arrest, Fuchs remained somewhat enigmatic. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't write memoirs from prison. He served his time quietly, still the reserved, introspective man he had always been. Klaus Fuchs was released from prison in 1959 after serving 9 years. And here's where the story takes another turn. He immediately moved to East Germany, the communist German Democratic Republic. Think about what that means. After everything, after seeing what communism actually looked like after the confession and the imprisonment, Fuchs still chose to live in a communist state. In East Germany, he wasn't treated as a traitor or a criminal. He was welcomed as a hero, someone who had helped the socialist world achieve nuclear parity with the capitalist West. He was given a prestigious position at the Central Institute for Nuclear Physics in Dresden. He continued his scientific work, now openly serving the communist bloc. He lived there until his death in 1988, just a year before the Berlin Wall fell, and the entire system he had believed in collapsed. But the story doesn't end with Fuchs' life. The legacy of his espionage continued to shape the world for decades. Let's talk about what his betrayal actually meant. First, the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union's early acquisition of nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the Cold War. If the U.S. had maintained its nuclear monopoly until the mid-1950s, as expected, the entire geopolitical landscape would have been different. The Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the balance of terror that defined the Cold War, all of it was influenced by the fact that both sides had nuclear weapons much earlier than anticipated. Fuchs didn't single-handedly give the Soviets the bomb. They had talented scientists of their own, but he accelerated their programs significantly, saving them years of research and countless resources. Second, the security overhaul. The Fuchs case exposed catastrophic failures in Western security vetting. How had a German refugee communist been allowed into the most secret military program in history? The answer led to complete restructuring of security clearance procedures, the creation of more sophisticated counterintelligence operations, and a level of paranoia that would characterize the Cold War intelligence community. Third, the human cost. Fuchs's information led to the exposure of a Soviet spy ring in America. Harry Gold, his courier, was arrested and served 15 years. Gold's testimony led to David Greenglass, who implicated his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953 in one of the most controversial cases of the era. Whether they deserved execution remains debated, but the chain of events that led to their electric chair began with Klaus Fuchs. Fourth, the moral questions. Fuchs's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, ideology, and conscience. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He wasn't motivated by greed or ego. He thought he was preventing a monopoly on nuclear weapons that could lead to catastrophe. Was he wrong? By conventional standards of loyalty and law. Absolutely. He committed espionage, broke oaths, and betrayed trust. But his motivations force us to think about what we owe to nations versus what we owe to humanity, about whether scientists have special moral obligations regarding weapons of mass destruction. Fifth, the scientific community. The Fuchs case deeply wounded the scientific community. Scientists had been given enormous trust during the Manhattan Project. The revelation that one of their own had betrayed that trust led to lasting suspicion and surveillance. The free exchange of scientific information was restricted. International scientific collaboration became fraught with security concerns. Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Los Alamos Project, would himself face security hearings partly because of the paranoia the Fuchs case created. So, what do we make of Klaus Fuchs in the end? He was a man of contradictions. A brilliant physicist and a committed spy, a refugee grateful to Britain who betrayed it, an idealist who served a brutal regime, a quiet man whose actions echoed through decades of history. Some see him as a traitor pure and simple, someone who prolonged the Cold War and endangered millions by contributing to nuclear proliferation. Others see him as a complex figure driven by genuine moral concerns, however misguided, about the concentration of nuclear power. The truth is probably that he was both and neither. He was a human being who made choices based on ideology, conscience, and calculation, and those choices had consequences far beyond what he likely imagined. The story of Klaus Fuchs matters today for several reasons. First, we live in an age of technological secrets again. Information about artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, quantum computing, and biotechnology is as sensitive now as atomic secrets were in the 1940s. The questions Fuchs faced about who should have access to powerful technologies are questions we're still grappling with. Second, the tension between national loyalty and global concerns hasn't gone away. We see it in debates about climate change, pandemic response, and technology regulation. Should scientists prioritize their nation's interests or humanity's collective welfare? It's the same question Fuchs faced, just in different contexts. Third, the story reminds us that espionage and betrayal are rarely simple matters of good versus evil. People commit espionage for complex reasons: ideology, revenge, money, coercion, or a mixture of all of these. Understanding those motivations is crucial for both preventing espionage and understanding international relations. Finally, Fuchs' story is a reminder that individual choices can change history. One man, working quietly, passing information he believed should be shared, helped trigger an arms race that brought humanity to the brink of annihilation. The consequences of our actions, especially when dealing with powerful technologies, can be far greater than we imagine. So the next time you hear about a spy case, about someone betraying secrets, don't just ask, what did they do? Ask, why did they do it? The answer might be more complex and more disturbing than simple villainy. Klaus Fuchs died in 1988, unrepentant about his espionage. In his later years, he said he had done what he thought was necessary for world peace. Whether you agree with that assessment or find it appalling, his story remains one of the most significant espionage cases of the 20th century, a case study in ideology, betrayal, and the terrible power of atomic secrets. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling me what you think. Was Klaus Fuchs a traitor or an idealist? And let me know what historical spy stories you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that history is always more complicated than it first appears.